Thank you, Indrani. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Observer Research Foundation and the Ministry of External Affairs for the invitation to speak here today. Let me begin by saying that when Indrani we talk of European powers in the Indian Ocean, we're really only talking of two countries, the UK and France, and possibly to a far lesser extent a third country, Russia. But if we look at the two countries, the UK and France, my sense is that both countries are realizing now that a new reality is catching up with India's traditional rhetoric towards the Indian Ocean. And we heard this from Admiral A.K. Singh a few minutes ago, that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government actually considers the Indian Ocean to be part of India's immediate and extended neighborhood, as well as it seeks a proactive role in taking on a greater degree of responsibility in shaping the region's security architecture. I think this is an important realization that is taking place now in the capitals in London and in Paris as well. And as an example of this, we had the recent International Fleet Review of Visakhapatnam last month, the first IFR in 15 years. Out of the 21 foreign countries represented, there were 3 European countries, the UK, France, and Russia. The UK sending a destroyer, France a frigate, and Russia a submarine rescue ship. Both the UK and France also have a stake in sustaining international trade and the freedom of navigation in this region. Both also retain sovereign territories in the Indian Ocean, the UK with Diego Garcia, and we heard about this when the former president of Seychelles spoke to us yesterday evening, and France, of course, with La Réunion. The UK recently established its first permanent military base in 43 years in Bahrain, and France, as we know, has bases in Abu Dhabi and Djibouti. Both the UK and France are also part of the European Union and NATO missions to combat piracy in the Indian Ocean and have a visible presence in the Persian Gulf as well as in the waters off the Aden coast. So with this presence, my sense is that there are 3 ways in which the UK and France could seek to further engage with India in the maritime sphere and in the Indian Ocean as well. And these 3 ways are bilaterally, trilaterally, and multilaterally. Let's look at the bilateral aspect first. In fact, there already is quite a bit that has recently been put on the agenda on maritime affairs between India and the UK and India and France. But the key really is to ensure that what is on the agenda is actually implemented, which also means that New Delhi needs to equally reciprocate on the implementation. If we look at the UK and the India-UK maritime aspect of relations, the new India-UK Defense and International Security Partnership, which was unveiled when Prime Minister Modi came to the UK in November last year, for the first time includes a new dimension on maritime security. It seeks to strengthen naval cooperation in the Indian Ocean through enhancing the Konkan series of bilateral naval exercises and the exchange of information to enhance maritime domain awareness that Admiral A.K. Singh just spoke of a few minutes ago. In addition, a new annual senior official dialogue on South Asia, which will include maritime issues, is to start between India and the UK. At the same time, India and France also regularly carry out bilateral naval exercises, with the French Carrier Strike Group having participated in the last round of these exercises. Last January, India and France held their first bilateral dialogue on maritime security in the Indian Ocean region. So I think in bilateral terms, there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of the implementation of what is already on the agenda. Let's look at the second aspect, and that is trilaterally. And here I pose a question. The UK and France are currently further strengthening their bilateral defense and security relationship. The 2015 UK National Security Strategy and SDSR, the Strategic Defense and Security Review, talks of a combined joint expeditionary force operational this year. Could the bilateral naval exercises that have taken place so far with India and the UK and France, could they evolve into occasional trilateral naval exercises in the Arabian Sea? Somewhat like, though not all fully similar to, the trilateral exercises that are currently being carried out among India, the US, and Japan in the Indian Ocean. And there are clearly advantages to this, but I suspect also some disadvantages. But it'll be very interesting to see if a trilateral nature of this exercise could actually take place in the Arabian Sea. The third and final point is multilateral. I believe that both the UK and France have sufficient diplomatic leverage to boost and help boost existing multilateral organizations in the Indian Ocean, partly in an effort at building an effective regional security architecture in the Indian Ocean. Both the UK and France are dialogue partners of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, and both are full members of the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, IONS, which A.K. Singh and Rick Smith have just spoken about as well. The 21-member IORA, with 7 dialogue partners, seeks to encourage economic cooperation and maritime security in the region. The 22-member IONS, with 4 observers, seeks to increase naval and maritime cooperation among the littoral states in the Indian Ocean. There is an important for India, but a distinction between the IORA and the IONS, to the extent that my sense is there will be a greater focus on IORA in the next few years rather than the IONS. But to conclude, we must realize also at the same time that Europe risks becoming far more inward-looking with current concerns over the refugee crisis, the stability and the sanctity of borders and the economy. And then, of course, there is the possibility of a British exit, the Brexit, from the European Union to be resolved through the 23 June referendum. But if there is a British exit from the EU, what would this mean for British foreign policy towards Asia and the Indian Ocean? Would it mean that it would have greater resonance or lesser resonance? I think we'll have to wait to see what the verdict of the referendum is before we go into this. But this does pose, again, an interesting question as to how the UK, particularly in this case, will be looking beyond 23rd of June on the Indian Ocean and Asia. Thank you. Very often, we talk about the Indo-Pacific. We've talked about the Indo-Asia Pacific. My sense is actually India's core interest has to be and must be the Indian Ocean. That is where India's focus will need to be. If we look at a map, it's a very large ocean, which has on the western part the Persian Gulf. India is doing some things on the security dimension there, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. Eastern Africa, again, something's happening, but again, a lot needs to be done. And of course, there's a lot of focus on the eastern side, look east, act east policy, etc. But the basic point for me is that actually when we look at the western side, your question on India, there needs to be a greater emphasis that this is part of a larger Indian Ocean focus. There is clearly, I think, a requirement diplomatically to focus on the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea. But I think we need to examine militarily India's capability in able to exercise leverage or influence in that theater as opposed to the Indian Ocean. I think there's a lot that still has to be done in the Indian Ocean first. Sure, thank you. I think on Russia, I briefly mentioned Russia when I started the presentation. I think at the moment, at least, there is also a sense that Russia is also looking more towards the immediate neighborhood, whether it is on the Ukraine issue and, of course, Syria, but other things economically as well. So at the moment, we've seen actually, notwithstanding the presence of a Russian ship at IFR, we've seen the Russian sort of, possible role or activism in the Indian Ocean decrease somewhat in the last 12 months. This may change, but at the moment, this doesn't seem to be the case in the current scheme of things. In terms of Rory's question on the UK and France and the role in the South China Sea, I think we've seen that there is clearly greater focus in London, particularly on the South China Sea. The UK Foreign Secretary made a policy statement a few weeks ago on this when he was in Southeast Asia. The usual, I think, the focus on freedom of navigation, strengthening the international law of the sea. Is there something that the UK is doing differently from the US? I'm not sure. What is the French policy on this? Also, I'm not sure on the South China Sea. But there is clearly a sense that the South China Sea represents a far greater sphere of interest for the UK, at least in terms of the momentum at the moment and the whole issue with China, than the focus on the Indian Ocean does.